The virtual lead marketing conference continues with its focus on loyalty engagement, analytics, and digital applications. I'm your host, John Karolewski. We have 4 more presentations today on topics such as e-commerce, big data, shopper behavior, and more. You can stay with us all day or just log into those presentations that interest you. Our next speaker will be talking about loyalty marketing. He is Jeff Berry with LoyaltyOne. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions along the way, type them in the chat box in the lower left of your screen. We'll answer them along the way as time allows, and hopefully at the end of the session as well. Now, after the session and before the next one, there will be the Great American CPG and Retail Trivia Quiz for valuable prizes, including the grand prize of a Kindle Fire HD. So stay tuned after this presentation. Again, the next presentation deals with loyalty, big numbers and big hurdles. Joining me now is Jeff Berry, Senior Director of Research and Development for LoyaltyOne. Now, without further ado, here is Jeff Berry.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you to everyone who's attending this session. I appreciate if you are on the East Coast, this is over your lunch hour, so join me in this journey along the path to talk about loyalty programs while you enjoy your lunch. We at LoyaltyOne, for those of you who don't know our organization, we are one of the largest loyalty program operators in the world. We do everything related to customer engagement. And one of the things that we try and do out in the marketplace is actually talk about the landscape of loyalty. What's actually going on? What are companies doing? Who's winning? Who's actually having success? What are some of the right strategies that companies should be employing in terms of driving more engagement out of their customers and ultimately yielding a better return from their investment as it relates to any marketing investment that they're making. We, on a biennial basis through one of our brands, COLLOQUY, which is an independent source for information about loyalty programs and customer engagement strategies, we run a census where we actually look at North American marketplace for loyalty programs, determine how many programs are actually out in operation, and what's actually the nature of the success with those programs, who's actually having success and who's driving the right kind of results out of that program, out of their programs. We've been running this study since 2000 initially. So this is a long-running study where we look at total number of loyalty programs in operation. The goal ultimately is to try and give the marketplace a better understanding of what's actually working. Ultimately, if you're going to make investments in loyalty programs, you want to ensure that you're either driving more customer engagement through higher visits to your retail location or more purchases of your specific products. You want to be trying to drive those customers to higher margin activities with you, or you want to be ultimately retaining them and keeping them from switching to the competitors. And so you've got those mechanisms at your disposal, and loyalty programs may be one way in which you're actually trying to drive that form of customer engagement. So without further ado, let me get into what we found in our most recent study that we conducted at the beginning of this year. So we're finding continued growth in the loyalty program market. These numbers, $3.3 billion at the end of 2014, represent the total number of loyalty program memberships that consumers hold in the U.S. So that is starting to get to almost 30 programs per household, 29 programs per household that consumers are actually engaged in. And relative to the two years ago when we conducted the study, that's a 26% increase in the total number of loyalty program memberships. So certainly if you study the loyalty program industry or you're involved in that industry, it may seem at times like companies are actually divesting some of their loyalty investments. We see that happening in some of the grocery industry. We certainly see new programs launching and new programs modifying the way in which they're actually trying to engage customers. But overall, there's a significant percentage of growth in the overall industry, 26%. That number's continued to climb over the 15 years that we've been running this study. We continue to see, order of magnitude somewhere in about the 20% CAGR mark in loyalty program growth. And so there continues to be huge appetite, at least from a company standpoint, in building loyalty programs and putting them out in the marketplace. And clearly you've got consumers who are actually saying, hey, these programs are potentially worth me joining. So this is strictly the number of memberships that consumers actually have. I won't ask you to answer this question, but I will ask you to answer it to yourself just in terms of what your company is actually doing. The question being, of these scenarios, how are you actually allocating, whatever kind of organization you're in, how are you allocating your resources against acquisition of customers and retention of customers? Think about that for a second as it relates to your own organization. Typically what we're seeing out in the marketplace is that most companies are spending somewhere between 75% and 90% of their total marketing investment in acquiring new customers. And that will really lead you then to understand how that loyalty program number continues to grow, where companies are building new ways for consumers to actually quote-unquote join programs, whether it's an overt loyalty program or a form of a CRM program, something of that nature. Most companies really are focused heavily on the acquisition side of their business. They continue to be, and I think that's been historically the case in credit card business, in telecommunications business, but I think that really does start to permeate across all industries, whether you're in retail, whether you're a CPG. The focus is, how do we actually get more customers? And while that's important, the real headline of this study is really this, and that is, despite the fact that there are 3.3 billion loyalty program memberships, averaging 29 loyalty programs per American household, consumers, in fact, are only actively participating in 42% of those. And that number actually has been on the decline since 2010. We saw in 2010 the first time that number actually started to go south. And so there's a real story that's starting to brew there as it relates to consumers maybe enrolling in loyalty programs, but they're certainly not using them. And when you think about the ultimate goal of the loyalty program is fundamentally twofold. One, have the consumer actually choose your brand over somebody else's because they're getting some incremental value through that program. And secondarily, there's a deep, meaningful data asset that's being created for organizations on the backs of loyalty programs, which ultimately would allow you to further make the right kinds of investments against your customers and drive the right kind of consumer engagement at the individual customer level. You need that individual customer data in order to be able to actually create meaningful engagement. And so if you've built a loyalty program and you've got a significant number of your customers enrolled in it, but they're not actively using it, you're really missing the opportunity to drive those two components of value. This trend for someone who spends all their time in the loyalty industry is actually quite alarming, because we do know that organizations have made significant investments in their loyalty program. The ongoing operational costs associated with those programs are generally pretty significant. There is clearly dilutionary cost associated with those programs, so you're rewarding customers for things they would have done otherwise. But if you're not actively attracting the right customers that continue to engage with you and change their behavior in a profitable way, and you need to design your program around that kind of customer behavior change, it's really difficult to get a positive return on investment over time. In particular, when you think most companies they focus on the acquisition component, most of the value out of your loyalty program back into your organization over time really is about how are you actually retaining your customers and creating deeper, more meaningful relationships with those customers. So, I think we should all be alarmed at this finding given the industries that we're in, but there certainly are some things that you can do, and I'm going to share some of those ideas. I'll get into a little bit more specifics on the study, and then I'll get into some specific ideas or things to think about as it relates to your own specific play in the loyalty space. Partly what we're seeing is organizations also tend to be focused in on their program as not a strategic asset, but really a marketing asset. And so when we think about at LoyaltyOne, when we think about the use and the underlying data that's acquired out of a loyalty program, the goal should ultimately be to help inform better decision-making across your organization. There's significant opportunity to leverage the insights that are driven out of your actual observed customer behavior that can create real meaningful opportunities. The other thing that we certainly see happening out in the marketplace is most programs are rather ubiquitous these days. You typically think about yourself as a consumer and how many programs you're involved in. In general, you probably get about a 1 or 2% return. You might not think about it that way as a customer, but if it's a cash-back program or you're collecting points with an airline to ultimately get a flight, you generally are getting about 1 to 2% back in value. But often what happens is because those programs cut across an entire consumer base, often organizations are actually using their best customers to subsidize their worst customers because they tend to not differentiate those customers in any meaningful way. They don't deny value at the low end of the file. They still reward everybody with something. And so there's real opportunity, I think, to think about the various customer segments that you have, and if you're sophisticated enough, and this is the next level sophistication, thinking about the specific individual customers that you have and the value they represent, and differentiating the interaction that you have with them on that basis. Let me talk a little bit about some industry breakdown. As part of the study, we look at different industries. So what you see on the screen, I won't insult you by reading it to you, represents the breakdown by specific industry. So for example, retail represents 39% of the 3.3 billion loyalty programs out in the marketplace. So there's certainly some change actually going on as it relates to what the loyalty program landscape looks like. Initially, loyalty programs were really born out of the travel industry. Frequent flyer programs were the initial loyalty programs, but clearly you can see retail as the dominant player as it relates to total program memberships, which is great in terms of the ability to talk to and interact with your customers at a retail level. So this has created the ability to actually now see who those customers are in a previously unknown consumer interaction. But what it also has done is created ultimately customer confusion. They have so many programs, their wallets, I affectionately often laugh at most consumers with 29 loyalty programs would have a George Costanza wallet, or they've got key fobs that are, make them look like they're a janitor on their key ring. That's pretty complex then in terms of how do you actually get the attention of your customers when they're involved in so many programs across multiple industries that provide different level of value. So let me dig into each of those specific sectors briefly. So retail represents 1.3 billion memberships out in the marketplace. And really what we're seeing is a couple different things. One is significant growth as it relates to the pharmacy industry. So clearly 3 major players. There are clearly others in the U.S. But in 2012, Walgreens launched their Balance Reward program. We've seen Rite Aid and CVS make some significant changes to the way in which they operate their programs in 2013. And what I think is really interesting and unique, and whether you're in this category or not, one of the interesting lessons to learn from these 3 specific players is they've really taken this approach of trying to integrate both transaction behavior, so observed actual behavior, as well as intended behavior. And so they're doing things like rewarding customers for writing product reviews. They're rewarding customers for healthy behavior. So they've tied, some of them are thinking about how they tie the things like Fitbit into those programs to ultimately reward consumers for holistic behavior rather than strictly about buy this, spend X and get Y. I think these companies should really, frankly, as it relates to how they run their loyalty programs, whether you agree with this across the board or not, really admired in the way that they've said there are specific customers that are particularly interesting to us, and we're going to create some tailored parts of our program to actually interact with those customers. So Rite Aid, for example, launched Wellness 65 Plus as part of their loyalty program. And they've been very specific about seniors are clearly a growing segment of the population, an important one, and one that we're going to create specific value for rather than, as I mentioned off the top, sort of diluting the value across the entire customer base. Some interesting things happening in the grocery space. We saw in 2013, Albertsons, Shaw's, and Acme and Jewel Osco out of Chicago, they actually divested their loyalty program, said we don't want to have a loyalty program anymore because the investment we're making there we're going to put back into pricing in our effort to try and compete against the Walmarts and the Amazons of the world. And so you see, although grocery really only represents 2% of loyalty program memberships, there's a lot of noise in the grocery space, continues to be. Companies divesting their loyalty programs. Many companies, as you will have experienced as consumers, have partnered with fuel retail, and so this fuel rollback concept is a very popular, albeit seemingly ubiquitous kind of offering. It's not like there's anything particularly unique in there, but it creates immediate value for the consumer and creates this bounce back into the grocery chain. So some really interesting things happening there. We also clearly watch Walmart, as most companies do, and Walmart has always been one that really has not had loyalty program as part of their DNA because of their strict focus on pricing. And even Walmart has really started to try and create some unique ways for consumers to interact with them that have the foundations of data collection, online purchase with in-store pickup. Starts to actually, it's not a loyalty program per se, but it starts to influence consumer behavior in a way that generates data and creates unique opportunities then for Walmart to talk to those customers. So continue to watch Walmart as it relates to how they migrate from we're strictly a price player and don't need to know who our consumers are, the unwashed masses are fine for us, to now really having this desire to understand consumers and link the behavior to a single individual or an individual household. Specialty retailer is always an interesting one, and we've seen significant growth in the specialty retail space, 20% growth. So things like Gap Card and GameStop. GameStop continues to be a real driver in creating unique opportunities through experiences with their customers, and they've been also very deliberate, not unlike the pharmacy category, in saying we care about teenage boys and we care about their mothers. And those are the two ways in which they actually have designed their program and interact with customers on that basis. Sephora, through their My Beauty Bag program, have done a lot to actually try to create customer loyalty beyond specifically how much you spend. And so clearly the spend is the driver, but they've created unique opportunities to come in store for private shopping evenings. They've really tried to create an experience for their customers through their program, and they continue to have and see success. So typically, what we're seeing and what I would predict is we'll continue to see growth in the pharmacy space. I think there continues to be interest in the category. The three major players that all have loyalty programs continue to evolve the way in which they interact with their customers, tying in that healthy behavior, so non-transactional behaviors along with the transactional component. But I think the real learning then becomes about how do you actually find ways to create sustainable growth. So you may or may not be in that space, but you need to continue to think about how you evolve your loyalty strategy to engage consumers in a way that continues to be interesting to them. And I think this is a much newer phenomenon. Back in early 2000s, most companies would put loyalty programs out in the marketplace and really not evolve them. They tended to be the same going forward. Now there's this need for consumers to have continued engagement and continued changes in how the program operates. So you might think about how you leverage data across your organization to do things like pricing optimization, which may not on the surface seem like a direct loyalty program driver, but it is a use of loyalty program that helps create operational efficiencies that ultimately creates consumer engagement because you've actually figured out what the right prices are on the products in a way that's extremely scientific. Think about how you actually focus in on creating short-term wins for customers. And so you might do, within the context of your loyalty program, you might create promotions that change behavior in a unique way. and then start to think about how you're actually investing in customer experience, which is clearly a buzzword in marketing these days. But I think ultimately customer experience comes down to what are you actually doing to tailor the engagement for the customer such that they feel like you understand them and you're trying to actually be relevant to them. I'll get into financial services quickly, representing roughly 580 million memberships. Really, we've seen kind of three major things happening in this space. Massive growth in the prepaid card world. So there's been 50% growth over the last 5 years. It now represents $500 billion in annual consumer spending, or actually happens through prepaid cards. And so typically those cards are not tied to any sort of customer data. So there's a real opportunity there to think about how you're integrating those prepaid cards in with your overall customer engagement strategy. Tons of store-owned private label credit cards certainly seems to be a way in which both retailers are actually offsetting significant bank fees or credit merchant fees through private label credit cards, but it also is a big driver of customer data, and clearly those programs will typically be focused on your most engaged customers already, but it does create a marketing platform by which financial service retailers are actually leveraging the financial component of the relationship to create more consumer engagement. And then you can't pick up a newspaper these days without reading something about mobile payments and emerging payment forms. And so the emergence of and the continued growth of non-traditional players in this space, I think, will continue to be something that actually challenges financial service institutions in how they actually continue to get customers engaged. So again, as we look forward, thinking about how you start to integrate prepaid cards, finding other sources of funding. There's tremendous pressure globally on exchange rates, and retailers in particular have a lot of backlash against the merchant fees associated with credit payment. So there may be, for financial institutions, other ways to think about linking and creating partnerships with retailers to offer things like card-linked offers. So you've seen on your specific credit cards, you probably have offers that you get from retailers if you use those credit products. Those are card-linked offers, and there continues to be other ways for financial service institutions to think about funding the overall customer engagement. And then again, clearly a significant amount of customer data is generated out of financial transactions, and so the ability to think about whether you're in that space or whether you partner with financial institutions, how you leverage that data could create unique opportunities to engage your customers in a way beyond strictly your retail wall or your the product packaging that you've got at your disposal. Travel and hospitality, again, one of the founders of loyalty programs representing 900 million memberships. And this, what is very common in the travel space is partnerships. And so whatever frequent flyer program you're part of or hotel program you're part of, likely you have the opportunity to earn points in some other category. And the goal there is ultimately about customer sharing. And so if I'm American Airlines and I know that somebody's traveling to Houston, why would I not partner with hotels and other travel-relaed organizations to be able to provide them access and insight to those customers to have those companies acquire the customer when they're actually in Houston. And so we continue to see in that space, partnerships is really a big driver of what actually works and is effective. And so I would expect to continue to see that. There's been significant change, clearly, and will continue to be. Most travel-related programs were born out of yield management, and so the notion was, how do I actually leverage my unused inventory, because as soon as the plane takes off and has empty seats, that's now distressed inventory that I can't take advantage of. In most cases, because of reduced travel routes, all kinds of places where hotel rooms are being sold, that there's not necessarily a ton of inventory available anymore. And so you do see programs in the travel space modifying the way in which they actually offer value to the customer. And in a lot of cases, they're eroding that value by changing the guardrails, moving, raising the bar in terms of how many points you need to actually have in order to redeem. Airlines en masse in the U.S. have moved from a points-based mileage-related program, how many miles did you actually travel, to how much are you spending with them, and it'll be interesting to see that as that change has just happened. It'll be interesting to see what impact that has ultimately on customer loyalty, because I think a lot of what's happening in this space has really moved away from its ultimate goal of trying to actually get the person who's traveling to get on your plane or to come to your hotel. Most consumers are playing games now associated with this. I'll pause again. Again, think about this question as it relates to your own organization. Which of the following does your loyalty program, or it doesn't necessarily need to be a loyalty program, but a marketing platform, if you will, offer to drive consumer engagement? Is it about points? Is it about discounts? Do you offer privileges? Is it promotional programs? Are you creating personalized engagement and offers? Typically what we see in the marketplace is the answer is A or B. It generally is we offer points, or our program is centered in and around discounts. But what we're starting to see is real significant growth in what we call emerging platforms. And these are platforms that are actually designed around bringing together multiple forms of consumer motivation, or focusing in on one that's not about one particular retailer. So there's some really interesting things happening across these companies. And again, I won't insult you by reading you the names of them, but really interesting emerging forms of interaction from a consumer standpoint across different forms of motivator. And so if you think about everything you do from a marketing standpoint is ultimately designed to motivate a consumer to do something they might not otherwise have done. And so as you think about your overall loyalty program or loyalty or marketing mix, think about how you start to integrate those efforts and bring the full offering of consumer motivators, consumer behavior change mechanisms to bear on consumers. Ultimately, that's the manner in which you have the most opportunity to influence the consumer and to stave off competition from a bunch of these players that are non-traditional and aren't today necessarily trying to play in your space, but I suspect ultimately will be. I'll touch very briefly on Canada for those on the phone that are north of the border. Canada is a loyalty market largely dominated by coalition loyalty programs. There are two major coalition players. For those of you who are unfamiliar with coalition, it's one common platform that cuts across multiple retailers or financial institutions, a bunch of non-competing companies that issue a common currency to create more value ultimately for the consumer. If you're paying attention to this space at all, it has not been a popular model in the U.S. It is popular the world over, but American Express just launched their Plenty program, which is a coalition program. So if you wanted to read more about it, that's a good company to look at in terms of how they've actually structured their program. The landscape tends to look pretty similar, but again, very dominated by this coalition idea. And in the last couple of years, there have been some real changes in the marketplace. In 2013, President's Choice, which is part of the Loblaw family of companies, a big number one grocer in Canada, launched their program that's attracted significant attention and is really tailored at the individual customer level. So it's putting a lot of pressure on other loyalty programs to ultimately leverage the data to create tailored one-to-one offers. Target entered Canada in 2013. They have now exited the marketplace, so they didn't make it even 2 years in Canada. Canadians beat them up quite a bit, so they have decided to leave. That shook the marketplace up, though, substantially. Retailers were terrified in 2012 about what would happen when Target entered the marketplace. And so you see a lot of shifts actually happening and, frankly, a lot of consolidation going on in loyalty programs as companies continue to think about how they engage their customers in the most meaningful way. So all of that to get to, the landscape is complex, the landscape is crowded, consumers are overwhelmed with loyalty programs, and many companies, probably likely yours, are thinking about Is this the right thing for us to be doing? Could we be reinvesting those loyalty dollars in other forms of marketing and other forms of consumer engagement? I'll challenge you with these 4 ideas as you think about the overall landscape and your place in it and how you're actually trying to create. Ultimately, you're not trying to, if you get customer loyalty, that's great, but loyalty is actually the outcome of a set of activities that you ultimately do to engage the customers. You need to create an environment in which loyalty is possible, but if your loyalty program is focused on transactions to drive loyalty, you're probably in the wrong place. And I think what we've seen in the marketplace is many companies either dramatically changing the way in which they operate their loyalty program because they feel it's not working, but they don't know what's not working about it, or they exit their loyalty program because they decide to take that investment elsewhere. And so I would offer these 4, and I'll talk about each of them in a little bit more detail, thinking about how are you actually assessing what's going on with your loyalty program appropriately. How are you actually thinking about your holistic approach, not your loyalty program in strict isolation? How do you actually prioritize customer experience over transaction behavior? And what is it you're actually doing to get personal with your customer? That sounds maybe a little dirty, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. So first off, I think that it's quick for companies to say, we're not getting a return any longer from our loyalty program, let's get out of this thing. And part of, in the effort to do that, part of what ends up happening is you lose visibility into customer behavior. You lose the opportunity to engage with customers in a way that's meaningful to them. And ultimately, you've got to think then about how you reinvest those dollars. And typically, most companies reinvest those dollars in their pricing. But as we know, pricing investments strictly over time are not a winning solution for most organizations. It's very difficult to compete against a Walmart and an Amazon on the basis of price. And so we think about really getting in and scrutinizing the elements of your loyalty program that are not working. And so that's suggestive of the fact that you've got actually benchmarks. You understand the benchmarks of the metrics that you should be looking at. So A, you understand the metrics that are important. B, you've got some reference point. And we at LoyaltyOne, we spend a lot of time compiling benchmarks to help our clients actually look at where they should be relative to where they are today. But clearly there will be things that are actually happening within the context of your loyalty program that are working, and obviously things are not. But getting down to the specific elements that are not working actually allows you to then make a meaningful assessment against those components and adjust accordingly. And so we have a real philosophy of find the core elements that aren't working, the root problem, not the symptoms, assess those, make modifications on that basis, test and learn, and then continue to assess those as you make changes. And so it's a very deliberate approach to thinking about how you evolve your program over time, but making fulsome, holistic changes generally is not the way in which companies are successful in migrating their loyalty strategy. Second is think about where if you sit in the room with your CFO, they're typically going to ask you what your loyalty program costs. Hopefully they're asking what return you're getting, but often over time it's difficult to make the direct connect on I made this investment in my loyalty program and I get this much incremental revenue out of it. There are other things that you should be thinking about as it relates to how you actually get the most value out of your loyalty program. And if you think about it on a more holistic basis, the underpinnings of your program being I have insight into specific customer behavior, then you would actually start to be able to say, how am I integrating everything I'm doing from a marketing standpoint in a loyalty program? And so maybe one day Jeff doesn't require points on this particular product. He'd rather have a discount, but tomorrow maybe he wants points on a specific behavior I'm asking him to do. And so if you really start to understand every investment you're making in marketing, your loyalty program could be the platform by which you actually deliver unique and tailored interactions on the basis of what I would like on a day in and day out basis. So you can optimize that way if you start to integrate what you're doing. Clearly, I think what we see in the marketplace is lots of organizations are operating a second brand, and that second brand is their loyalty program, it's important to think about how your loyalty program is fully integrated and synonymous with what you're actually trying to pay off in the marketplace from a brand value proposition standpoint. So if you are in the instance where you're running an organization and you're running a separate loyalty brand, I think further integration to support your overall brand objective is something you should be looking at. And then lastly, this idea of the wealth of data contained within a loyalty program should ultimately be able to inform all kinds of decisions that you make within your organization. How do you lay out your stores? How do you create the right merchandising decisions based on data? What's the right pricing? How do I think about staffing in a retail environment on the basis of when people are shopping? There's more to that data than strictly driving marketing offers. And that's a real way, if you are sitting with your CFO, it's one of the ways that you can start to justify the overall investment is across the organization. Thinking about then your customer experience, and again, I do think customer experience is a bit of a buzzword these days. We like to think about customer experience here as the sum total of consumer interactions that actually create positive momentum towards loyalty. And so if you think about how you actually understand which elements of the customer experience most expose your consumers to want to actually leave, we would call that revenue at risk. What's the total pie as it relates to how many dollars are tied into specific activities? You then could start to tailor experiences around those. And so your loyalty program, although not the exclusive way to do this, may be the underpinnings of how you actually start to create to identify the experience elements that are most important and most critical to your operation, but then also start to create real-time interactions against those. And so as things like beacon technologies and consumers pushing more and more on the mobile front become important, I think it'll be really interesting to see how you start to actually integrate your overall customer experience into your loyalty program, or frankly, vice versa, your loyalty program as an element of your overall customer experience. We see, we run a number of different studies throughout the course of the year, and we found in our most recent customer sentiment study that 84% of customers said, I know that you as a company have data about me. In fact, I know what that data is, but I really feel that you're collecting it primarily for your own use, and I don't feel I get a lot of value out of it. And then 75% say that they're really not getting any form of personalization out of the information you have, and they're craving it. There will be a tipping point in the marketplace, I think, where the democratization of data becomes prevalent and consumers actually are aware of the value that data has. So one of the ways to get ahead of that is actually to start leveraging that data to create much more personalization. And I think if you think about your own experience as a consumer, where companies are relevant to you, create offers and engagements that are meaningful based on the things you've already done, or frankly based on the information I might have been willing to share with your company, that you're much more likely to feel that company understands you and is adding a level of value that's worth turning left across traffic to go to a fuel retail, or driving 3 miles further down the road to go to a different grocery chain. Those are the measures ultimately of customer loyalty, where they're willing to go out of their way to actually do business with you. But in order to get there, you need to think about how you're incorporating these 4 different ideas into your overall customer engagement strategy to ultimately drive the right kind of value back into your organization. So I will stop there. A couple last shameless plugs as part of what we do. Here we run Colloquy, again, a free resource for you. If you're interested, you can join that distribution list and get access to all the content on our website. And it's all about how do you actually create the right customer engagement to drive profitable value back to your organization. I will stop there, John, and if there are any questions.
Yes, there is one question, Jeff. Do you have any insight into the office supply superstore loyalty programs and the consumer response to them? That is, rebates, and it's like getting it for type of program.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, we do find things like rebates tend to be, the consumer response is that they tend to be sort of an antiquated two-tier pricing system. There's often a feeling that, you know, if you're just going to unilaterally give me a rebate offer and now I have to jump through a couple hoops, why don't you just give me that offer at retail? And we know, as people who are in these organizations, we know that's not how it works. But it actually creates a lot of discontent amongst consumers. So in some of our research, we find that the rebate type format is not one that consumers really love. There's clearly a move to more instantaneous kinds of offers and ones that engage them in a different way. As it relates to the office supply category, we tend to just see a lot of flat growth in the space and not a lot of consumer activation. I think part of and this will extend to a number of organizations, it's a category that has a small percentage of consumers that shop extremely frequently, and those tend to be the people who value some sort of loyalty initiative because they're likely running small businesses, things of that nature, and so they're getting a lot of value back. And then you've got the mass amount of consumers that have very infrequent visits, a couple times a year, and that, you know, and that will extend into things like a home renovation category, similar sort of category where you might have 3 transactions a year. So it's difficult to actually create enough value for a consumer in that regard. So things like instant discounts and you know, unique workshops that you might create, more experience type things, are what we hear in that space consumers being more interested in. I'm happy to dig, that's sort of the high level. I'm happy to dig into that more. I've provided my contact detail here. If whoever's asked that question, if they're interested in chatting more about the category, I'd be happy to do that.